Picture this. A peaceful Saturday afternoon, the sun casting a warm glow over the bustling streets as you stroll into the mall for some afternoon shopping. Suddenly, a deafening roar shatters the tranquility as walls crumble, ceilings start falling, and panic surges through you, realizing there's no escape from this unfolding nightmare. Well, back in 1995, this was the scenario for shoppers at Sampoong, a famous high-end luxury department store that collapsed, taking the lives of 502 individuals and injuring many others. What events could have led to such a tragedy, and what was responsible for the largest peacetime disaster in South Korean history? Before the Korean War in the 1950s, South Korea was a developing country whose economy was primarily agrarian, and the country faced significant challenges, including poverty, underdevelopment, and political instability. The wars didn't help matters, resulting in widespread destruction, loss of life, and economic difficulties. It was a tough period for South Korea and its citizens. However, over the next few decades, South Korea's economy grew at an astonishing rate, transforming it from a war-torn agrarian society into one of the world's major economic powers. South Korea's post-war economic transformation, only referred to as the Miracle on Han River, was primarily driven by key initiatives implemented before 1980. Under the leadership of President Park Chung-hee, the government played a central role in planning, financing, and directing industrialization, with a focus on heavy industries like steel and chemicals. Additionally, South Korea adopted an export-orientated growth strategy, emphasizing the production of goods for international markets. Large family-owned conglomerates, known as chaebols, including Samsung and Hyundai, played a pivotal role by expanding rapidly and becoming global industry leaders. Foreign aid and investment, particularly from the United States, also played a part in supporting South Korea's economic recovery and transformation into a first-world nation. By the early 1980s, South Korea's capital city, Seoul, was selected to host the 1988 Summer Olympics. This was the major highlight of the country's impressive progress. Following this booming economic period, construction and retail firms expanded aggressively, willing to take any measures to keep up with the economic explosions. And because of bans against international construction contractors signing contracts for projects in Seoul at the time, almost all buildings were being erected by South Korean companies who, due to the heavy workload on them, made these constructions as quickly as possible, willing to neglect certain procedures. The initial idea for the Sampoong Department Store was a 4-story apartment building, and the Woosung Construction Company was hired for the project. However, midway through the project, Lee Jun, the leader of the Sampoong Group construction division, made a significant change in direction. The original plans for an apartment complex were completely changed, and instead, the invention was to create South Korea's largest and most luxurious department stores. To change the building's purpose, however, Lee had to make extensive changes to the design itself. This included modifying the size and number of support beams to make space for escalators and other features. There were also plans to add an additional 5th floor. However, Lee was warned against this process by Woosung Construction, and they wanted no part in his new plans. In response to this, Lee fired them and decided that his own construction company would take over the project. The Sampoong Department Store opened to the public on July 7, 1990, and it was quick to attract customers. Over 40,000 individuals visited per day, and for 5.5 years, business thrived. By the mid-1990s, The store's sales amounted to more than $500,000 a day. Sampoong was the central hub of Seoul, unique both in external facades as well as interior amenities. However, beneath the aesthetics and glamour was massive amount of corner cutting and structural weakness unknown to the normal day-to-day visitors. In June 1995, days after it had passed the regular safety inspection, the first signs of pending doom began to appear. Cracks spidering up the walls in the restaurant area, and water pouring through crevices in the ceiling. On June 29, structural engineers were called in to examine the building. After thorough inspection, they declared the building unsafe. However, the only response by Lee and his management staff to this was moving merchandise and stores from the top floor to the basement. June 29, 1995 started as a lovely day, especially for the Seoul citizens eager to patronize the famous Sampoong Mall. They trooped in masses and activities went on as usual. On this day, two significant events occurred. First, due to a concerning increase in the number and size of cracks, the decision was made to turn off the air conditioning units and block access to the 5th floor for customers. Structural engineers were brought in to assess the situation. After thorough inspection, they warned that a complete structural failure was imminent. However, the store was unusually crowded that afternoon, and the management was reluctant to evacuate the building to avoid losing sales. In another surprising turn of events, most managers and executives left the building. Several hours later, around 5:50 p.m., the building started producing cracking sounds that echoed throughout the structure. This prompted store employees to finally initiate evacuation procedures. Regrettably, by that point, it was too late. The air conditioning units collapsed through the compromised roof of the 5th floor, causing the already stressed support columns to collapse, leading each floor to collapse onto the one beneath it. Chaos took over. Screams echoing through the air and bodies colliding as shoppers desperately fought for their lives. A lady stood there, watching in horror as a middle-aged man next to her was crushed to death. Hope vanished from her eyes, just as it had for most of the over 1,500 people trapped inside Sampoong that day. Rescue teams arrived at the disaster site within minutes after it happened. They brought cranes and heavy equipment the next day. However, the mayor of Seoul, Choi Pyong-yol, initially decided to stop the rescue operations because he was worried that the unstable store could collapse further. This decision led to massive protests, especially from friends and relatives of those still missing, and eventually the search for survivors continued while stabilizing the store using guy cables. Against all odds, 3 individuals were rescued. Sadly, these individuals recounted that some of the people trapped under the debris of the department store survived the initial collapse, only to perish due to the efforts of the fire department to extinguish the fires caused by burning cars. Over 500 individuals lost their lives, and numerous others sustained injuries in the disaster. The disaster also resulted in property damage totaling approximately $216 million at the time. The investigation into the collapse started and shifted towards structural failure. The Sampoong Department Store was designed using a flat slab approach, which means that the building lacked a steel frame or steel beams that would have provided better support for carrying weight. Instead, each floor was held up by concrete columns. Unfortunately, Sampoong made use of lower quality steel reinforcing rods during construction, which were thinner than what the law required. As construction progressed, Lee also transformed the original planned 5th floor skating rink into a collection of restaurants. These dining areas were heated using a system of underfloor hot water pipes known as ondol, a common heating method in Korea. However, the weight of this heating system added more stress to the already burdened columns that were supporting the building. Despite the building already being heavily impacted by these alterations, the most problematic decision was to install 3 air conditioning units on the roof of the 5th floor. These units collectively weighed 45 tons, which was more than 4 times the weight that the building was originally designed to support. Adding to the increasing list of issues, neighbors living to the east of the building started complaining about the noise generated by the air conditioning units. In response, management decided to relocate the units to the west side of the building. However, instead of using cranes, which was the standard method, they chose to move the units using pulleys and rollers. This unconventional approach caused cracks on the roof, and these cracks expanded due to the vibrations produced by the air conditioners every time they were turned on. Ultimately, the investigators pinpointed the direct cause of the collapse to the building's history. If the developers had adhered to the original plans, the structure would have been twice as sturdy as necessary. And considering all the mistakes, it's astonishing that the building had managed to stand for 6 years. On December 27, 1995, after several incriminating statements, Lee Jun was found guilty of criminal negligence and received a prison sentence of 10.5 years, later reduced to 7.5 years. His son, who was also the store's CEO, Lee Han-sang, received 7 years for accidental homicide and corruption. Others were also sentenced for crimes related to bribery and building regulations violations, including local government officials and company executives. The Sampoong Group, 2 months post-disaster, agreed to sign all of its money and assets over to the victims for compensation, resulting in a total of around $300 million being paid out to 3,293 cases. The disaster prompted a profound and necessary response. Upon discovering that even the concrete used in the building was of substandard quality, and recognizing the extent of cost-cutting measures, there was a revision of Korean safety standards. Subsequent inspections revealed a disturbing reality. Many other buildings in Seoul were also at risk of collapsing. Out of 50 buildings examined, only 1 was considered safe. Greed, corruption, and a lack of serious law enforcement resulted in a tragedy that could have been avoided. Lee and his team undoubtedly became the most reviled man in South Korea's history, not just for their actions, but for the disgraceful strain they represented in the country's modern history. Due to their actions and inactions, families never got to see their loved ones again, and children who only wanted to have the great experience of shopping with their parents at the prestigious mall never returned home. Find this narrative fascinating? Subscribe to see more like this, and don't hesitate to click on the next video.